Machiavelli's brutal formula for escaping poverty on a low income. Let me say something that's going to sound strange at first, but stay with me, because by the end of this video it's going to make complete sense. But you must watch full video for that. Being broke and being poor are not the same thing. Broke is a number. It's what's sitting in your bank account right now. Broke is temporary. Broke is a condition. Poor is something else entirely. Poor is a way of thinking. It's a set of instincts, a way of making decisions, a relationship with time and risk and opportunity that gets installed in you, usually without your permission, and it doesn't go away just because the number in your account gets bigger. Here's the part that's going to sting a little. You can stop being broke and stay poor forever. It happens constantly. People get the raise, get the better job, and 5 years later they're in the exact same psychological position they started in, just with nicer things around them while they're in it. So if you're on a low income right now, I need you to hear this clearly. More income will not fix this by itself. I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying it because it's the only honest starting point. If income was the actual problem, lottery winners would stay rich. They don't. Most of them are broke again within 5 years. So clearly something else is running the show. Now here's where this gets interesting, because the person who understood this better than almost anyone in human history wasn't a financial advisor. He wasn't a self-made billionaire. He was a disgraced Florentine diplomat, writing 500 years ago, broke, imprisoned, tortured, and completely irrelevant to the halls of power he used to walk through. Machiavelli. And here's what almost nobody tells you about the prince. It wasn't written for kings who already had armies, allies, and treasuries. It was written for the opposite kind of person, the new ruler, the outsider, the man with nothing, surrounded by people who wanted him to fail, trying to build power from a position of almost total vulnerability. That is, structurally, the exact same position as someone on a low income trying to build a life. No inherited advantage, no safety net, no margin for error. Everyone around you either indifferent to your rise or quietly threatened by it. Machiavelli wasn't writing finance advice. He was writing a formula for exactly this situation. And today, we're going to pull that formula out of 500-year-old political philosophy and apply it, piece by piece, to the very specific, very modern problem of building a life on a low income. 5 moves, in order. And I want to be upfront with you, if you skip one and jump to the next, the whole thing falls apart. I've seen it happen. This isn't motivation. This is a sequence. And most people fail not because they don't work hard enough, but because they're doing move 4 while they're still missing move 1. Let's get into it. Before we get to the formula, I need to take something away from you. Not permanently, just for the next few minutes. I need you to set aside everything you've ever been told about how to escape a low income, because almost all of it is aimed at the wrong target. Here's an experiment. Picture 2 people, same job, same salary. Let's say it's $40,000 a year, give or take, depending on where you live. Same rent, roughly, same bills, on paper, financially identical. 10 years later, one of them is still there. Same job, maybe a small raise, still living check to check, still one bad month away from disaster. The other one owns a small business, or has moved into a role that pays double what they started at, or has some kind of asset quietly working in the background. Same income, wildly different outcomes. What happened? It wasn't the money. The money was identical. What was different was what each of them did with the part of their life that money doesn't touch, their time, their decisions, their sense of who they were allowed to become. One of them treated the $40,000 as the ceiling. The other treated it as the floor. This is the first thing I need you to sit with, and it might be uncomfortable. Raises don't fix this. I've watched people get a 20% raise and be in exactly the same financial position 18 months later, because the moment the income moved, the lifestyle quietly moved with it. The car got a little nicer. The apartment got a little bigger. Nothing was reckless. It never feels reckless in the moment. but the gap between what came in and what stayed closed right back up. Income doesn't compound on its own. Behavior compounds. And if the behavior underneath stays the same, the income is just passing through you on its way to somewhere else. So if income isn't the bottleneck, what is? This is where Machiavelli becomes relevant, and I want you to really hear this, because it reframes everything that follows. The Prince is not a book about people who already have power learning how to keep it. Most of it is about a man with nothing, no hereditary claim, no army of his own, trying to take and hold a position in a world that is actively hostile to his rise. Machiavelli calls this a new principality, and he says explicitly that it is the hardest and most dangerous situation to be in, because you have no existing loyalty, no margin for mistakes, and everyone around you is watching to see if you'll fail. If you're on a low income right now, trying to build something from almost nothing, you are structurally in exactly that position. And Machiavelli's answer to it was never work harder or hope for good fortune. His answer, again and again, was that fortune only controls about half of what happens to you. The other half, he's very specific about this, is something you design. So here's the real enemy we're dealing with today. It's not your income. It's what scarcity does to your mind while you're living inside it. There's real research on this. Behavioral economists have studied it under the name scarcity, and the finding is almost eerie in how well it explains what we're talking about. When people are under financial pressure, their attention gets pulled entirely into the present, not because they're undisciplined, because scarcity narrows the mind's time horizon by default. It's not a character flaw. It's what a stressed brain does under constraint. You stop being able to think 5 years ahead, because there's a bill due in 5 days, and your brain treats that as the emergency that matters. I want to pause here for a second, because I think this is the part most financial advice completely misses. Nobody sits you down and says, the reason you can't think long-term right now isn't weakness. It's that your mind has been trained by necessity to survive the next 30 days. And a formula built for someone who has that kind of margin will not work for someone who doesn't. That's why budgeting apps and just save more advice fails so often on a low income. It assumes a mental operating system you don't currently have access to. So the formula we're building today isn't really about money. It's about deliberately overriding that survival operating system, one move at a time, until a different identity, a strategic identity, is running the show instead. 5 moves. Each one only works once the one before it is in place. Most people fail because they try to skip straight to move 4, the income move, the flashy move, while move 1 hasn't even started. So we're not doing that. We're going in order. Let's start with the fight you've probably already been losing without realizing it. Move 1. Stop fighting the battle you can't win. Here's a mistake I want you to really examine, because almost everyone on a low income makes it, and it's not their fault. It's what they've been told to do by literally every piece of financial advice aimed at them. The mistake is trying to save your way out. I want to be careful here because I'm not telling you to be reckless with money. That's not the point. The point is about where your effort goes. If your primary strategy for escaping a low income is cutting expenses, no coffee out, no subscriptions, meal prep everything, track every dollar, you are optimizing something that has a hard ceiling. There is a mathematical floor to your expenses. You can only cut rent so much before you're homeless. You can only cut food so much before it affects your health. Eventually, the spreadsheet runs out of places to cut, and you hit a wall, no matter how disciplined you are. Earning has no such ceiling. This is the first identity shift I need you to make, and I want you to actually feel this one land, not just nod along. There is a version of you right now that thinks of yourself as a saver, careful, responsible, watching every dollar. And I understand why it feels safe. It feels like control in a situation where you have very little control. But saving as a strategy quietly keeps you in a defensive posture forever. You're always guarding a small amount of ground. You're never taking new ground. Machiavelli has a principle that applies here almost perfectly, even though he was talking about war and territory, not personal finance. He said, in effect, never commit your resources to a battlefield that favors your enemy. If the terrain is against you, you don't fight harder on that terrain, you find different terrain. Your enemy in this case is a ceiling. Saving fights on ground that has a ceiling, producing doesn't. Let me give you a concrete picture of this. Two people, same starting income, same year. One of them spends real-time hours a week, months on end, refining their budget. New app, new spreadsheet, new categories. It feels productive. It feels like progress. And to be fair, it probably tightens things by maybe $100, $200 a month if they're diligent. The other person spends that same block of hours, not more time, the same time building one skill that has actual market value, something people will pay for. And a year later, the first person has a slightly tighter budget. The second person has something that can change their income permanently. Same hours spent, completely different trajectory. I want to be honest with you about why this is hard to accept. Cutting expenses feels safe because it's within your control immediately. Today, this hour, you can decide not to spend $5. Building a skill that increases your earning power feels uncertain, slow, and exposed. There's no guarantee it pays off on any particular timeline. That discomfort is real. But I'd ask you to notice something. The safe path has a guaranteed ceiling. The uncertain path has no ceiling at all. You are trading a small, certain outcome for the possibility of a large one. And if you never make that trade, the ceiling is the only outcome you will ever get. So here's the identity shift, stated plainly. You cannot economize your way out of poverty. You can only produce your way out. That doesn't mean spend recklessly. It means stop treating budget optimization as your primary strategy and start treating it as what it actually is, basic housekeeping, necessary but never sufficient. The real strategy lives somewhere else. And that somewhere else is exactly where we're going next, because there's a resource sitting in your life right now, completely underused, that doesn't require a single extra dollar to deploy. Move 2. Convert time into a weapon, not a wave. Here's a question I want you to actually sit with for a second instead of rushing past it. What did you do with your free time yesterday? Not judgmentally, I'm genuinely asking you to picture it. The evening after work, the commute, the stretch of time before bed. For most people on a low income, that time gets treated as recovery. And it needs to be to some degree. You're exhausted, the work is hard, rest is not optional. But here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath that. On a low income, time is often the only asset you have in real surplus. You may not have capital, you may not have connections, you may not have margin in your budget, but you almost certainly have hours in the week that are currently being spent on distraction rather than direction. This is the second mistake, and it's subtle because it doesn't look like a mistake in the moment. It looks like rest. It looks like you deserve a break, and you do. But there's a difference between resting on purpose and disappearing into your phone because thinking about your situation is uncomfortable. One restores you, the other quietly erases years. Machiavelli's framing here is really useful because he wasn't naive about resources. He understood that the ruler with no army has to use whatever he does have far more aggressively than the ruler who has everything. If you have less capital, less connections, less institutional advantage, the things you do have need to work harder for you. And for almost everyone reading, watching this right now, the thing you have in surplus is time. Not huge amounts. Not 8 extra hours a day. But real usable pockets, the commute, the lunch break, the hour before bed, the weekend morning. I'm not talking about hustle culture here. I want to be really clear about that because hustle culture burns people out and usually points that energy in 10 directions at once, which we're going to address directly in the next move. I'm talking about something much quieter, deciding deliberately that a portion of your available time each week is no longer neutral. It's not rest, and it's not obligation. It's invested. Here's what that actually looks like in practice, and I want to give you something concrete rather than abstract. 20 minutes on the commute, used to learn instead of scroll. One evening a week protected where you're building something instead of consuming something. That's it. That's genuinely it at the start. This is not about drastically restructuring your entire life overnight. That never sticks anyway. It's about identifying the pockets that already exist and pointing them somewhere that compounds. And I want to name the emotional part of this honestly, because I think it matters. This is the moment where a lot of people feel a kind of grief, a recognition of years that already passed without this redirection happening. I've felt that myself, looking back at stretches of time I can't get back. I'm not going to tell you not to feel that, but I will tell you this. The only thing worse than losing those years is losing the next ones too, in exactly the same way, because acknowledging the loss felt too uncomfortable to actually change anything. Time invested compounds the same way money does, quietly, invisibly, for a long stretch, and then suddenly it doesn't look invisible anymore. But it only compounds if it's pointed at something. And that's the problem with most people who do get this far. They redirect the time, and then scatter it across 10 different things, learning a little bit of everything and ending up an expert in nothing. Which brings us to the move that actually determines whether all of this effort produces anything at all. Move 3. Choose one narrow skill with leverage, not 10 broad ones. I want to name a very specific trap, because it's one of the most well-intentioned, responsible-looking mistakes a person can make, and it quietly guarantees you stay replaceable. The trap is collecting certificates, courses, a little bit of this skill, a little bit of that one, being well-rounded. It feels productive. It feels like you're taking your development seriously, and on a resume it looks disciplined. But here's what markets actually pay for, and this is worth saying plainly because almost nobody says it out loud. Markets do not pay for effort. They pay for scarcity. They pay for the thing that is hard to replace. And breadth, by definition, is not scarce. Being generally competent at 10 things puts you in direct competition with millions of other generally competent people. Being genuinely excellent, or even just noticeably above average, at one thing that has real demand attached to it puts you in a much, much smaller room. Machiavelli understood this in military terms, and the translation is almost exact. A force spread thin across many fronts is weak everywhere. A force concentrated at a single decisive point can break through where a diluted force never could. Concentration wins. Dilution loses. It doesn't matter how much total effort you're putting in. If it's spread across 10 directions, none of those directions ever gets enough force behind it to actually move. Let me put two people side by side again, because I think the contrast makes this land better than the abstract version. Same starting job, same income. One of them stays a generalist, a bit of this software, a bit of that certification, capable of doing lots of small things adequately. The other one narrows deliberately into one skill that has real leverage behind it. Something people are willing to pay specifically for, a trade, a technical skill, sales, something concrete and in demand. Not because it's their passion necessarily, because it's leverage. A few years later, the generalist is still interchangeable, replaceable by anyone with a similar spread of small competencies. The specialist has become the person people specifically ask for. And here's the part that matters most. Once you're the person people specifically ask for, you stop competing on price. You start setting it. I want to acknowledge something here because I think it deserves to be said honestly. Narrowing feels risky. It feels like closing doors. What if you pick the wrong skill? What if it doesn't pan out? That fear is real, and I'm not going to pretend it away. But consider the alternative you're actually choosing if you avoid narrowing: permanent invisibility. Being useful in 10 small ways is invisible. Nobody remembers the person who was fine at everything. Being essential in one way is power, and power, even in one narrow lane, gives you something breadth never can. Leverage to negotiate, leverage to be selective, leverage to eventually expand on your own terms instead of being forced to. Being useful in 10 small ways is invisible. Being essential in one way is power. Sit with that for a second, because it's going to matter for the rest of this video. But here's the thing nobody tells you about skill alone, and this is where most people, even the ones who do everything right up to this point, quietly stall out. A skill without a reputation attached to it is a secret, and secrets don't get paid. Move 4. Build position before you build income. Here's a mistake that looks like ambition but is actually a trap. Chasing the next paycheck instead of the next relationship, the next reputation, the next point of access. I understand why this happens. When you're on a low income, every decision gets filtered through an urgent question: what pays right now? And that urgency is legitimate. Bills don't wait for long-term strategy. But if every single decision you make is filtered through what pays this week, you will never build the thing that actually changes your trajectory, because the thing that changes your trajectory rarely pays immediately. It pays eventually, and it pays much more later, precisely because you didn't chase the immediate version. This is position, and I want to define it clearly because it's easy to confuse with income, and they are not the same thing. Income is what you're paid right now for the work you're doing right now. Position is how known, how trusted, how relied upon you are within a specific circle, an industry, a neighborhood, a network, a reputation for solving a particular kind of problem. Income moves when your paycheck moves. Position keeps compounding even in the months your income doesn't move at all. Machiavelli was extremely clear about this, and I think it's one of the most underappreciated parts of his thinking. A wise new ruler, he says, secures alliances and reputation before he secures treasure, because treasure without position gets taken away. Wealth without standing is fragile. It invites resentment, competition, and loss. Standing, once built, is much harder to take from you, and it tends to attract the treasure toward it rather than the other way around. Here's what this looks like in an ordinary life, not a political one. Someone becomes known inside their specific world as the reliable one, the one who follows through, the one who solves the problem nobody else wants to touch, the one people specifically recommend by name when someone asks, "Do you know anyone who?" That reputation isn't paying them extra this month. It's not on the pay stub, but it is quietly compounding, and at some point, often faster than people expect, it starts generating opportunities that never would have reached them otherwise. Somebody mentions their name in a room they weren't even in. Somebody thinks of them first, before the job is even posted. I want to pause on something honest here, because I think it's the emotional core of this move. Building position requires doing good work before you're compensated fairly for it. That can feel, in the moment, like being taken advantage of. And sometimes it genuinely is. I'm not telling you to let people exploit you indefinitely. But there is a real difference between being exploited and investing. The difference is whether it's building something that compounds toward you, or whether it's simply being extracted with nothing coming back. Position building is the former. You're not doing it forever. You're doing it deliberately, for a defined window, because you understand something most people never stop to consider. Income without position is temporary. It can be taken from you in a single conversation. Position, once it's real, is much harder to strip away, because it doesn't live in one employer's decision. It lives in how a whole network of people think about you. Here's the identity shift for this move, and I want you to actually feel the weight of it. Stop asking, "What does this pay me today?" and start asking, "Who does this make me to the people who matter in my world?" That single question, asked consistently, changes almost every decision that follows it. But there's a final move here, and it's the one most people skip entirely, because it's the most uncomfortable of all 5. You can do everything else right, the skill, the time, the position, and still stay stuck, because you never actually left the environment that was built to keep you exactly where you started. Move 5. Exit the room before they notice you've changed. I want to be honest with you about this one, because it's the move that costs the most, and it's the one almost nobody warns you about. The mistake is staying loyal to the people, the environments, and the self-image that match your old income level, long after you've started to outgrow them. Here's why this happens, and I don't think it's a character flaw at all. Environments have gravity. The people around you, the places you spend time, the version of yourself that everyone already knows and expects, all of that pulls you back toward the center, toward the familiar, toward what's already comfortable for everyone involved. And when you start changing, thinking longer term, narrowing your skill, building position, protecting your time differently, you don't just risk external resistance. You risk something quieter and more painful. The discomfort of being seen differently by people who have only ever known you one way. I want to name something honestly here, because I think this is the moment in the video that matters most, and I don't want to rush past it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with changing while the room around you stays the same. Nobody prepares you for it. You'd expect people to be encouraging, and some will be, but plenty of others will feel, even if they never say it out loud, a little unsettled by your shift. Not because they wish you harm. Because your changing quietly asks a question of them they'd rather not answer. Why haven't I changed too? Machiavelli's version of this is almost startlingly direct. The ruler who wants to rise, he says, must be willing to be misunderstood, even by the very people who once knew him best. Visibility of change invites resistance. It's not personal. It's just what happens when someone breaks a pattern that a group has quietly, silently agreed to maintain together. I think about this sometimes in a very ordinary way, not a dramatic one. Someone slowly stops being available for every low-stakes hangout, not because they've decided their old friends don't matter, but because they've started protecting the hour they used to give away automatically. Nobody announces it. There's no confrontation, no speech, no dramatic exit. It's quieter than that. It's just less time in the old room and more time somewhere that's pulling them forward instead of holding them level. And here's what I've noticed, watching this pattern play out again and again. The people who succeed at this rarely explain themselves while it's happening. They explain it later, if at all, after the change is already real, when it's no longer a request for permission but simply a description of who they've already become. Here's the identity shift for this final move, and it's the hardest one to actually live, not just understand intellectually. You don't need permission to leave the room. You need to be gone before anyone thinks to ask you to explain yourself. That doesn't mean cutting people off coldly or being ashamed of where you came from. It means recognizing honestly which environments are quietly asking you to stay exactly as you are, and choosing, deliberately, not to keep paying that price. Let's put this together, because I don't want you walking away with 5 separate tips. I want you walking away with a sequence, and the order genuinely matters more than any individual move on its own. You stop fighting the battle you can't win, the ceiling of saving, and redirect that same energy toward something without a ceiling. That frees up the effort. Then you convert your surplus time, the one resource almost everyone on a low income actually has, into something invested rather than something spent. That gives the effort a place to go. Then you narrow that time toward one skill with real leverage, instead of scattering it across 10 shallow ones. That gives the effort force. Then, once the skill is real, you point it toward position, reputation, trust, being known, rather than chasing the next immediate paycheck. That gives the effort reach, well beyond what any single job could pay you. And finally, you leave the rooms that were quietly built to keep the old version of you comfortable, because no amount of skill or position survives an environment actively pulling you back toward where you started. Skill before position, position before income, income before comfort. Skip a step and the ones after it collapse. I've watched it happen to people who had incredible skill but no position, and their income stayed capped anyway. I've watched people build position without ever leaving the room that created it, and watched that position slowly erode back to nothing. Here's the last reframe, and I think it's the one that actually matters most, underneath everything else we've talked about today. Machiavelli never believed fortune was irrelevant. He believed it controlled about half of what happens to any of us, genuinely, honestly, half. But he was insistent again and again that the other half is something you design, not hoped for, not waited on, designed deliberately, move by move, especially by the people who start with the least room for error. So if there's one sentence I want you to leave with today, let it be this. Poverty was never really a lack of money. It's a lack of sequence. The money was often available the whole time, sitting just past a series of moves nobody had shown you how to make in order. You know the order now. If this video changed the way you see money, even a little, don't stop here. What you've learned today is only one piece of a much bigger picture. There are deeper lessons about wealth, power, human behavior, and strategy that most people never take the time to understand. If you want to think differently from the crowd, subscribe. Every video on this channel is built to help you make better decisions, build lasting wealth, and play the long game. No hype, no empty motivation, just strategy. Most people will hear these ideas, agree with them, and go back to living exactly the same way with the same habits. A small few will use these ideas to build a different future and to change the direction of their lives. The choice, as always, is yours.